Good afternoon, everybody. How are you today? Thank you very much for joining us. And if I could just remind you to please, unless you're asking a question, keep your microphone on mute because there are quite a few people on the Zoom and that will keep down any distracting background noise. Thank you for that. Again, thank you for joining us. My name is Jenny Wolf. I'm the head of program here at the Cambodia Institute of Directors. And we really thank you for giving us your time today. These webinars, monthly on a regular monthly basis, are always free of charge, complimentary. All you need is access to the internet. And always on topics that you can use as you follow your own personal leadership path. So we encourage you to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn or sign up for our newsletter so you know the topics each month and can join us or tell your friends or colleagues about them as well. I want to always say that as you follow along with us and learn about what we do and the development of good corporate governance on all levels in Cambodia businesses, that we're open to suggestions from you. Well, what do you want to hear about? What's important to you? What do you want to learn more about? And think about that as we walk through the presentation today on risk management. Now, I want to say, again, thank you for being here. I want to get to the actual reason that we are here today, and that is a discussion of the foundations of risk management. It's a complex topic, certainly not something that you can learn in an hour. But it does provide an overview and it will allow you to discover aspects of this you might want to study more deeply. And it'll give you some ideas maybe on subtopics within this overarching big picture risk management issue that you'd like us to pursue in future webinars and workshops or that you want to pursue on your own. We will always be happy to also give you reference materials if you'd like to dig a little more deeply on your own. Our guest presenter today is a gentleman who has lots of hands-on experience in this topic, 30 years worth, in fact, maybe a little more than 30 years worth. He's been very generous with his time and experience, so please feel free to ask your questions. You can drop them into the chat on the screen and we'll monitor them or raise your hand. Dave is rich in experience in risk management. He's also got a great deal of experience in governance, near and dear to our heart, and overall strategy with this very strong focus on building resilient financial institutions. But I'll say that the topics, the points that will be discussing today can apply to any organization, large or small, profit or not-for-profit. He served as Deputy CEO of Satapana Bank. He's been Group Risk Officer of Chin Development Financial Group in Taiwan and CIMB Group Malaysia. He was Chief Risk Officer for Asia Pacific for the Royal Bank of Scotland and Chief Credit Officer for Asia Pacific at the Bank of America. Dave also brings his experience as a board member of KGI Bank in Taiwan and PT Bank CIMB Indonesia. So you can tell he's got a strong foundation in both risk management and good corporate governance. He has more than 30 years of experience, in fact, all in Asia, mostly in Asia, including Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia, and now Cambodia. And we are super glad that he has found us here in Cambodia, or that we found him, and really grateful for his willingness to be here and share his experience today. Again, reminder, please enter any questions into the chat or raise your hand on the screen. We'll monitor on our end as we go along. We really want this to be interactive, an interactive conversation. So I'll be quiet now and turn it over to the main event here. Dave, thank you so much. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, and thanks for inviting me to present. So everyone, I appreciate it's your lunch. Thank you for joining. What I say to you is, I'm sure you're eating right now, but if you're not, put on your seatbelt because we're going to drive this car very, very fast and cover a few topics. But before I start that, you may say, what do I bring to this presentation in this topic for you outside of my professional qualifications, right? What I hope I can bring is real world or practical perspectives, not academic or ChatGPT responses. You'd think as a risk person, many, many years as a risk person, I'd be someone with a very conservative and cautious approach to life. I don't fit that profile. 32 years ago, I left a absolutely fantastic job in the United States covering global aerospace and defense companies in the US to move to Asia with my wife. Back then, 32 years ago, Asia was not a cool place to be. The cool places to be were London, New York, San Francisco. Money wasn't particularly good in Asia, but I sensed that it was the future. And I made that risk reward assessment, something we'll talk about later today. 32 years later, I've had plenty of professional and personal risks, and I'll try to share some of those. As Jenny mentioned, I've lived in 6 countries, 3 of them twice. So literally 9 moves in 32 years. I've worked for 5 different banks: Bank of America, Royal Bank of Scotland, CIMB Group, China Development Financial Group, and Satapana. So I've taken a lot of professional risk to get where I am. Maybe people could go on mute. Thank you. When I moved from Singapore to Malaysia, so we're moving from a foreign bank to a local bank, a regional bank, people in Singapore thought I was absolutely crazy. High risk, right? Just stay at a foreign bank, live in Singapore, great life, right? The move to Singapore was absolutely career changing for me. The risks were incredible. I was one of 2 Caucasians out of 40,000 employees in the bank. I was the only Caucasian or foreign executive in the company. When I moved from Taiwan to Cambodia, the Taiwanese thought I was absolutely crazy. They viewed a move to Cambodia as extremely dangerous. Again, the move has been absolutely fantastic. I sat in Thailand during the Asian financial crisis. I've seen and worked for 2 banks that have failed. And I've seen many, many near risk events, which I'll share with you today. Last few comments is I have 4 sons, all born in Asia in 3 different countries, which is not low risk. I'm happy to say I'm still married to the same woman. As we talk today, I'm someone who's taken quite a bit of risk, both sensibly calculated, as well as maybe in your mind recklessly, but it was aligned to my personal goals and the goals of my family. So as we start this conversation, I'm trying to make this presentation a little more personal. What is your starting point of risk tolerance? You personally, how much risk have you taken to get where you are? As we think about the fundamentals of risk, what about your company? What's the company's risk tolerance that you work for? Because what we're talking about today is not textbook. This is real. The examples I'm going to give you are real, right? So this is not academic. I'm having trouble getting to the next page. Excuse me just a minute. Here we go. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about what is risk. What is your definition of risk? My definition of risk. What are the types of risk a business can face? A framework, a sensible framework that maybe you can deploy, or parts of it you can deploy. Talk about the concept of iceberg of ignorance, and I'll explain that later for you. And then potentially how to avoid that iceberg of ignorance in your company. So as Jenny mentioned, if you have comments, questions, please just raise your hand, go into the chat, or at the end of the conversation today. I'm happy to take those comments, questions. So let's look at a definition of risk. And again, I'd ask that you not be a passive bystander in this conversation. So one definition of risk comes from Warren Buffett. And for some of you who maybe are not, do not know who Warren Buffett is, if that's the case, he's the greatest investor in the world and also one of the richest men in the world. So He invests on behalf of his own funds, and those funds are public. So he says risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. Very simple, right? Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. But what is he actually saying here? Let's take a minute and think. This sounds like a very simple sentence. Let's think about, what is Warren Buffett actually saying in the sentence? Just think of 1 or 2 points. I'll give you a minute. The good news is, since I can't see any of you, and this is an online presentation, I can't call on you. So I will give you my answers. It's worthwhile for you to think through your answers. First of all, Warren Buffett is a risk taker. He became, at one point, the wealthiest man in the world. I think he's number 3 or 4 in the world by taking risk, right? So Warren Buffett in the sentence is not saying, don't take risk. He is not saying that. The second thing Warren Buffett is saying is, he's saying, take the risk with the best available facts. That's all Warren Buffett's saying. Now, just to finish off this point, as I mentioned, Warren Buffett is supposedly the greatest investor in the world. He always buys good companies at cheap prices. It's a very simple model, right? But he takes plenty of risk in analyzing his companies, and he's willing to take on risk. So a textbook definition of risk is, business operations refer to an event or condition that could negatively or positively impact the achievement of business goals. This could be financial loss, reputational, legal, compliance issues. But if we manage those properly, here we outline 5 things that make risk positive. Better information, decision-making, we're protecting the value of the company, supporting resiliency and sustainability, enhancing efficiency, and building compliance and risk culture. But let's dig into this a lot more. First of all, this is an important point because this says risk negative and positive, or negatively and positively. And my first question when I asked you is, how do you think about risk and your own risk tolerance? My question is, most people don't think of risk as something that can be positive. They think defensively. But if you're going to be good at risk management, you need to realize there's negative aspects to it, as are in anything in business, and there are positive aspects to it. My suggestion as we go through this, and I hope to provide you many tools, is we need to be on the offense when you manage risk management. You cannot be on the defense. And I'll talk later about the tools to make that happen. So the 5 points, enable informed decision-making, et cetera, sound very textbook. So let me give you some perspective here. In my experience in working for 5 different financial institutions, the ones that did poorly, including the ones that failed, was the strategy was not well defined. So you may say, wait a minute, risk and strategy, I don't understand the link, Dave. They're absolutely linked or correlated. So the starting point for discussing risk management is understanding the corporate strategy. Now, of course, if the corporate strategy is not documented and well understood, then you're in trouble. And I'd suggest that's where you need to start. So the question then is, okay, risk and strategy could be linked. But then what's the process? What tool can I use, or if I'm on the board or CEO, to understand how to link these? And one is very simple. Are risk considerations taken up front in the budget process? or after the fact. So let me give you an example. Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, it was called back then, was one of the 10 largest banks in the world. Okay. It had a motto, a logo, very famous, said, make it happen. So RBS, make it happen. Okay. That's very bold and action-oriented culture. The problem was there was not much strategy sitting behind that. Not much detail either. So at RBS, when I was there, the budget was passed by the board and then given to the risk teams after the fact. And at that point, we were left with trying to figure out what to do with it. And if we didn't do something with it, it became our fault, right? So there was no alignment between revenue, capital, liquidity, and the reality of the risk profile of the company. Let me give you a good example. So that experience left me very scarred by the leave RBS, because RBS failed as one of the 10 largest banks in the world and was nationalized by the British government. Okay? So let me repeat that again. One of the 10 largest global banks in the world failed. It was nationalized by the British government. Yeah? That's an experience you don't want to go through. So when I became the group CRO and chief credit officer for CIMB Group, which basically is a bank that operates in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, I refused to let that happen. So here's a tip, okay? Because if you say to your CEO or to your board, hey, I want to inject risk into the budget decision, the CFO, the CEO say, no, it's too complicated. Let's just talk numbers. What I did at CIMB is I held a workshop with the board. It was admittedly voluntary, but the board gets paid, so they always showed up. It was a pre-budget workshop that basically provided them a comprehensive overview of the risk profile of the various CIMB business entities by country. So this was a 100-page document, right? But we would walk them through it, of course. So before the budget, any number was talked about, risk had a workshop with the board to talk about risk. Like, I mean, where are we today and where are we going? So we hijacked the process. So this would start with, what's your macro overview? What operating environment are we headed into for the next year? Right? What are the regulatory changes that are coming to our business? What are the competitor changes the board needs to consider? More importantly, what's the end-to-end credit process? And in a bank, that can be credit risk, it can be liquidity, it can be operational risk, many aspects. We would quantify those as much as possible and provide a grade of good, moderate, or poor. So for example, banks have non-performing loans. For each division, we'd look at 3 years of non-performing loan history, right? We can quantify that. It's not, you can't argue around that, right? It is what it is. We provide each department a score. Okay? So let's keep in mind, I'm not telling the board what to do here. At the end of the day, I'm giving the board the facts. The key point was, I was asking the board, do you want to grow this business? Do you want to increase the profile? Or do you want to keep the risk profile the same for the next year as you think about the budget? Or do you actually want to reduce it? And in some cases, you would reduce it because they have bad audit findings, they have bad asset quality, maybe they have regulatory issues, et cetera, et cetera. So for every department in CIMB Group by country, we would use the term increase our exposure, hold our exposure, or decrease our exposure. That was a decision by the board, not me. I simply provided them a comprehensive overview of the bank. From the outcome then, the board's decision was given to each business unit. Then the budget process started. So you can see that at RBS, we were handed the decision after the budget was approved. At CIMB, I switched that around so that the board was forcing the board to make a decision. How much risk do you want to take to meet the budget? Right? And then we handed that to the business and the CFO. It was very effective because the board's responsibility is to make informed decisions. So in a company, this is a risk reward trade-off, right? This is all about business. So if you look at a few examples outside of CIMB or RBS, in a couple of these companies, I have owned the shares over the years, so it's kind of watched them closely. You know, Apple was not always a phone tablet business. They had a product called the iPod, and many of you probably aren't even old enough to know what that was, but you used to buy this and download music, and the only purpose of the device was to listen to music. And Sony had a similar instrument, but I think they used a disc. And 20, 30 years ago, that's how you listen to music. Apple realized that that was going to evaporate because they realized that the smartphone eventually was going to be the instrument that people housed their interaction. So they actually, over the years, abandoned the iPod and went into an unproven market called the smartphone business. Again, this is within my lifetime and potentially yours. This is not 100 years ago. They did this when the smartphone was really not something visual. You didn't pick it up to watch videos. So they're letting go of a gold product, absolutely making money, printing hand over fist. And they went into the smartphone business. Today, the smartphone business, the handphone business, is 50% of total sales. So that obvious conversation between the board and the risks associated with that must have been very intense. Another company, Netflix, has not always been a streaming business. This business used to be a DVD rental business. Again, some of you may be too young to understand this, but you used to go to a store and buy or rent DVDs and take them back and shove them into a machine and watch movies on your TV. Sometimes you would buy the illegal ones in the market, right? And that's how it was done. Netflix, again, realized that, same as Apple, that the TV was no longer going to be the primary instrument for people to view video. So they went into a massive transition at a significant cost upfront and risk to avoid or anticipate the disruption. If they got that wrong, the company's gone. Again, I'm giving you examples of these are real risks these boards were taking, and they made a great decision. In my first job, I worked for Bank of America. I was brought a deal on a coffee startup. Now, again, back then, you used to go to the canteen, you get a styrofoam cup, you put Nescafe in and maybe some dry powder, right, and drink coffee. It was free. The concept was that you're going to go to a store, enjoy this coffee shop, and pay a premium for coffee. I thought this was the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. I declined the deal. Why would you pay a lot of money for coffee? Right? The company's name was Starbucks. Right? Later, many years later, Starbucks went IPO. They went public, right? And as any good husband, I gave my wife half my bonus. I said, "You invest what you want to invest, and I'll invest what you." She bought the IPO of Starbucks. I told her, "Look, honey, this is a fad. This will come and go, right?" And here we are, 30 years later. Those shares have split and multiplied in value many, many times. So these companies had to take very, very bold steps. And you need to be in the room if you're managing risk to make sure that informed decisions are made. Because otherwise, if you're sitting on the fence or your company is not moving, you'll definitely be out of business. So the next line is protect the value of the company. Well, every example I just gave you was disruptive, right? It wasn't necessarily protecting the value of the company today. It was anticipating something unknown or something that people saw. Let me give you an example of protecting the value of the company. Because if you don't do that today, you don't have it tomorrow, right? You can't have the Apple conversation, the Netflix conversation. So during COVID-19, which is obviously a horrific experience, airline industry was probably hit the hardest, if not one of the hardest industries globally. And many airlines needed government bailout. So I worked as a chief credit officer and chief risk officer for a bank, which had a relationship with two airlines, Singapore Airlines and AirAsia. And I'm sure you know both these airlines. They both fly into Phnom Penh. In the case of Singapore Airlines, they have a sizable government ownership by the government of Singapore. In the case of AirAsia, they have a very entrepreneurial CEO named Tony Fernandez, who basically bought this bankrupt airline and built it to be a very successful discount airline. But during the Asian financial crisis, during the COVID crisis, Singapore Airlines was extremely effective in managing some significant risk. Airlines need fuel, jet fuel, to fly, right? They buy that on a forward contract. Simply put, I'm going to take delivery of X amount of jet fuel in 6 months because I have X number of planes. They don't buy it spot, like tomorrow I need jet fuel. They buy it on a forward basis, trying to lock in prices. Well, obviously, what happens during COVID to jet fuel prices? No one's flying, prices collapse. You have to, in these contracts, take the jet fuel at the price you guaranteed it at, which is very high. Singapore Airlines decided to take the one-time hit on all those contracts. As a result, they maintain an investment grade. AirAsia, being a more dynamic, entrepreneurial company, decided to company and hold on to the trades, hoping that COVID would end quickly. It didn't. It didn't end well. So Tony sell part of the company to save the company. Yeah, that's real. That happened during COVID. That's very different business decisioning, right? So the next point is resiliency and sustainability. And this comes to a Cambodia example. Each of you have an assessment of how the local economy is doing, but generally speaking, the local economy is not doing that well. The government wants to grow the economy out of the current problems. Banks are a critical part of growing the economy, helping companies grow. They provide debt to grow. NBC made the decision when they realized that bank lending was growing at like 4% or less, when historically it's grown at 20%, that banks were tied down with too many NPLs, non-performing loans. So they allowed they allowed banks who were facing viable companies that were experiencing difficulty during this period of time to extend the maturity repayment profile up to 3 times, with a customer potentially only paying interest, not principal. Now, in banking terms, this is very unheard of. So I can't pay you the principal and interest. So I'm going to give you a moratorium of a grace period for up to 3 years of the principal. Now, I'm sure this is a very difficult decision for NBC, because if the economy doesn't pick up at the end of 2025, you have a lot of banks and a lot of companies that may not be in very good shape. But I'm sure a lot of debate was, and a lot of good risk discussion was made between the government and the central bank. Operational efficiency. Look, anytime you think about operational efficiency, you think of the Japanese, right? And Toyota used to be a very sizable client of mine at Bank of America. And if you've ever researched Toyota, they run a lean production process. And let me just give it very simply to you. Risk is decentralized to the frontline workers, the factory workers on the floor where they're assembling the cars. Root cause analysis is done when they see a mistake. so it's not repeated. So the factory workers have the ability to stop factory production line at any point if they see a material issue. That is very unusual and very productive. I think all of us would agree that, when you buy a Toyota car, you think the car is highly reliable. And I think that's why. Culture, we'll talk about later. This can be a very difficult topic in Cambodia because unless it's a very switched on CEO, leader, board, the culture is the owner because a lot of these companies are not public. In two recent organizations I worked at, this was the case. So in many cases, it was the P&L at any cost, and the risk profile was picked up later. That's not good. I can tell you, though, that there are companies that are doing a much better job than that. Let me move on. What are the types of risk? So strategic risk, which is really poor strategic execution, operational risk, which is inadequate controls, failed internal processes, people, systems. Financial risk, which we just talked about. Compliance and legal, which is really causes reputational damage or fines. Reputational risk, which really hurts the reputation and image of the company, the brand. And that's really exacerbated by social media. And emerging risks. So let me go into this in more detail. So two of the most dynamic companies in Indonesia is Gojek and Tokopedia. This is a Grab equivalent, Alibaba equivalent in Indonesia. Indonesia is a huge country. The problem with this is they decided to merge these two companies to fend off Grab. They did it in a very, very rushed acquisition. So this should have been an absolutely fantastic acquisition. Because they rushed the acquisition, didn't really understand the integration risk. Today, the rumor is that this new combined entity, is up for sale to Grab. Because the IPO price, the current share price, is well below the IPO price. So the shareholders are frustrated. Let's move on operational risk. Maybank, CIMB, DBS, I'm going to use as an example. Mobile app. Look, we all transact 80 to 90% of our transactions in mobile app. Resiliency of that is important. These banks are systematically important. And when their mobile app doesn't work, it's a material issue for the stability of the banking system. In this case, these banks have experienced hundreds of millions of dollars of fines because of this. Financial risk. This can be a bit tricky in an emerging market like Cambodia. And let me just tell you the Cambodia context right now. Cambodian companies took on a lot of debt during a high growth period of time. Then COVID hit. The economy has not recovered. And so they're left with a lot of debt, not enough cash flow to service the debt. So they have high leverage and weaker cash flows because the businesses are not doing well. Some of them are in real estate, for example. No one was really anticipating the ranges of leverage and cash flow leverage that these companies should be taking during good times and bad times. It's easy during the good time to think about this, not in the bad. Compliance and legal risk, I think in an emerging market like Cambodia, you're always playing in the gray area. And so if you're the risk manager or the board or the CEO, you need to make sure you stay out of the gray area and stay in the white area. Because the minute you go in the gray area, you're lost. Reputational risk, for the sake of time, I won't go into this, but this can be extremely damaging for both the board, the CEO, and for the company because of social media. Emerging risks. So during COVID, I was a CRO and CCO for CIMB Group, which is the 5th largest bank in Southeast Asia. In that environment, you could get very lost in the day-to-day management of risk during COVID. We are in discussions with the central bank every day about what to do. So in order to ensure some level of sanity and a map for the entire company, we developed 4 scenarios, potential scenarios, and the various outcomes, and assigned probabilities to those various scenarios. So in a bank, that would include credit risk, operational risk, liquidity, regulatory risk, et cetera. So 4 different scenarios of what may happen during COVID. We updated it as frequently as daily and shared it with the board. It was basically a map for everyone to hold on to. And in 2 of those scenarios, in 2 scenarios, the company needed capital quite a bit. So it's a very uncomfortable conversation, but at least we could see everything. I'd also add that although it's uncomfortable, the board and management greatly appreciate knowing what's coming. Let me go to a framework. As I mentioned before, you need to define, sorry, not you, the company needs to define corporate objectives and strategies. A risk management framework will not work very effectively if you don't know the company strategy. And then a risk department is supposed to identify, analyze, evaluate, treat, and monitor those risks, and communicate and consult them. Now, that's all very textbook, so I'm going to give you some examples. So strategy, and I've given, having a corporate strategy, again, it's not the responsibility of the risk team, right? It's a responsibility of the board. Excuse me, it's the responsibility of management to propose to the board. This stage needs to be set before you can have an effective risk framework in place. It's a starting point. And this applies to any sector. This is not banking. It can be insurance, healthcare, energy, aviation, construction, education, et cetera. So when you talk about identifying and documenting potential risks in the business, these are potential risks in the business. My suggestion to you is keep this simple and focus on the highest risk areas before you try to jump over the entire company and identify every risk in the company. It's too much, particularly if I haven't done this too far. Don't try to do everything. Second is define the risk well for everyone in the organization to understand. Use risk definitions, have a library of risk. So when you're talking risk people, and I'm a risk person, it's almost like you're speaking a different language. You're speaking Khmer, I'm speaking Vietnamese, right? So you need to harmonize the language, the risk language in your company. The second is, do you have a first line of defense, a second line of defense, and a third line of defense in the company? The business owners are clearly the first line of defense. They may not know that, but they are. But they're in the best position to determine the risk profile of their department. And they own the P&L. Analyze, evaluate, treat risk, monitor, and review. This requires the right standard operating procedures or SOPs to be in place to support those activities. Are those in place in your company? Because if they're not, you're going to have to work with the business to get those in place. Or if they're inadequate, those are a fundamental foundation to be in place. From that, you can set limits. From that, you can do what they call control testing, which is like an auditor, right? Are things being done effectively? So we've determined who owns a risk. It's the first line of defense. Secondly, you need to empower them with tools to determine on a continuous basis if they're following the SOPs, the procedures that supposedly the board has approved. Then you need to validate the effectiveness in this. So what's the role of the second line of defense here? People often say, I do the reporting. Absolutely not. The second line of defense needs to determine the effectiveness if the first line of defense is actually adhering to this, right? They're doing the control testing properly. They're within the risk appetite set by the board. What's the best way to do this? Well, with a heat map, red, yellow, green. They're either red, they're not doing it They're not within the risk appetite, or they are, or they're somewhere in between. That makes people jump when they see that. If they know they're going to the board, they get even jumpier. But again, transparency is very important because the board has supposedly given management the ability to manage the risk. They want to make sure it's done properly. Let's go to the iceberg of ignorance. What does this mean? Senior management in a company is often unaware of a majority of the risks occurring at lower levels of the company. So this is a study done years ago, and basically the awareness of the problems is that top management understands 4%, and the frontliners understand 100%, and in between, various levels of management know something. My question to you is this your company? If so, this is a great opportunity for you to improve things. If you're in top management, this should be very concerning, and you should be asking your risk team or the relevant departments, why do we not have the right framework in place? Why is information not being escalated? Right? Because a board member has a fiduciary responsibility. A CEO has a reputational responsibility. Right? So let's dig into this a little bit more. Oops, excuse me. So if you're senior management or a board member, you may be frustrated in the Cambodia context that what your risk team or risk reporting provides you is endless reporting. Endless risk reporting, 200-300 pages sometimes, with a lot of data and terminology you don't understand, without a clear summary of what are you trying to tell me. Now, often board members, senior management, may be shy to raise their hand and say, hey, I actually don't know what this term means, or I don't understand what you're trying to tell me, because risk is a defensive topic. So you, if you manage risk or have responsibility for it, have the opportunity to go on the offense here. As I said before, translate the language into something people understand. Make it very simple. Explain it to your mother, your father. If they understand it, maybe the board members will as well. I'm not saying the board members are not smart. It's just you use a lot of jargon in the terminology. This is a fact, and this is not a criticism. After the financial crisis, there was a global financial crisis in 2008. Various regulators went around the world to figure out what happened. And they wanted to ask the question, what happened? Because many financial institutions failed. Lehman Brothers, one of the largest securities company in the world, failed. Washington Mutual, the largest savings and loan in the US, failed. RBS, a top 10 global bank, failed. Fortis, one of the largest financial institutions in Europe, failed. And there's a long list after that. This is all in the same year. This is a crisis, right? But there were many, many lessons that these regulators and reviewers did. And it came down to poor risk management at all these entities. And more importantly, the board did not know the risks that these FIs were actually taking. So they didn't understand the funding profile, for example, of a bank, or the complexity of the products that they were carrying on their balance sheet. And all these institutions had a risk committee. Now, you may call that ignorance or incompetence. But how could they possibly do their job in these global, respected brands fail? You as a risk officer, when I worked for RBS, had failed. When I moved to CIMB, I felt an enormous responsibility to make sure I translated the risk profile of the organization end to end to our board and senior management. And I tried to make it as simple as possible and outline the key risks they needed to know. So how do you make this as effective as possible? Because in Cambodia, the capital cushion companies have today, because their leverage is very high, their cash flows are weak, is a lot less than it was 5 years ago. So if you're in the risk team or if you're on the board, you need to demand this. What is the most important, highest risk we are running in the company today? What are we doing about it? How much room do we have? Are we red? Are we yellow? Are we green? Ooh. I apologize. Anyway, for the sake of time, I'll keep going. So how to avoid the iceberg, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning, we need to change the narrative. Risk needs to be played both defensively and offensively, much like a soccer match. If all you're doing is playing defense, you'll never score. You never have a chance. So always think about risk in the context of football, offense and defense. You win in both sides, but it's very difficult to win if you're only playing defense in football. I've been part of senior management of many financial institutions. I've been on boards in Taiwan and Indonesia, and the risk teams also reported to me. So I understand the absolute end-to-end process, all the way from the most junior risk person to the board. So change the narrative to offense is my first advice to you, to the board and downward. Translate risk into a language people understand. And if you're on the board or in senior management and you don't get this today, ask for it, demand it. Dashboards are very simple. You can do it in Excel if you don't have anything else. Very, very simple, both historical information as well as forward-looking information. Incorporate and highlight the strategic initiatives from the CEO. So CEO may be saying, hey, risk isn't very fun to talk about. Well, in your reporting, take the strategy and incorporate it into that. One Cambodian bank asked me to look at their dashboard. It was 12 pages. I'm like, wow. So the risk officer had dumped everything into it and simply put it into a dashboard. It's too much. It's too much. You have the responsibility of condensing this down to size that the board can cover in an hour or two. It is very briefing to the board. I'll give them 200 pages and I've relinquished my responsibility. I've done it. That's not true. So if your team still wants to do that, appendix everything. Give a 3-page dashboard, 4-page dashboard, and stick all the 200 pages as an appendix. And if the board wants to read it, it's there. Your responsibility is to highlight the key risks in the past and in the future so the board can make informed decisions. Alignment is very important. And at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about strategy and risk. The first step to do this is, as I mentioned before, the budget process. So if risk consideration is not taken when the budget's done, you need to change that dynamic. Because you're not doing justice to your board. It has nothing to do with you as a risk manager. You're not doing justice to the board members. The board members want this information. They need this information to make better decisions. Now, if the board in Cambodia or if your CEO says, oh, no, you're it's not happy to talk about, and the board's never seen this before, my suggestion is try to incorporate a little bit of it by working with the CFO. Sneak it in a little bit, year by year, right? Just start to do it. Start small with the most important things and progress over time. Third point is transparency. So keep in mind, this is very important because management, the CEO needs to be very clear. What authority has the board given him to run risk, to manage risk? Are you clear? Are your company clear? The mandate specifically given to you. Because if not, when something goes wrong, the board's going to say, I had no idea. Your fault. The board has a responsibility to approve the risk limits, the policies and procedures to manage, and the framework to manage an effective risk in your company. Don't assume you have that authority. As a board member, I took offense to that. As I said before, dashboards are great tools to transmit risk. Keep it simple. So I can only tell you that you may say this is a task too hard, but in the last 3 organizations I've worked in, all Asian organizations, we did do this. It got done. We moved to dashboards. We also, and they would show red, yellow, green, which is very scary, right? If you're red, the board's very unhappy. Not my fault. That's the business owner's fault. I'm just reporting this, and I'm talking about the mitigations. At the end of the day, we could run CIMB Group on 6 pages, right? Now, we had hundreds of pages after that, but this is a bank that operates in 6, 7 countries, right? Certainly, an organization in Cambodia can do it in 4. As I said before, SOPs, standard operating procedures, need to be pushed down. A lot of times, I don't think people know the SOPs at all in the company. Have you done an inventory? Do they know they own them? Who owns them? When we did this in the last 2 organizations I worked at, they thought risk owned the SOPs. I don't own the SOPs. I don't run the business. There's a lot of clarity. It's very important. If this isn't the case, the foundation is very weak for you to run risk. Roles and responsibilities. Who does RED? Who manages risk? So obviously the KPIs and incentives need to be clear. And if those are not clear, and I suspect they're not in a Cambodia context, you need to work with HR and the CEO to slowly but surely move that. Without KPIs related to risk or incentives, it's very difficult. In a 3 lines of defense model, you will need to make sure you reinforce this in your company. Last few things for me, clear escalation process. Here are the issues that people don't like to escalate. And let me give you a funny example, right? So at CIMB, again, 5th largest bank in Southeast Asia, we transmitted customer data on tapes. I'm not sure why. And we stored them in a go down, right? So we'd hire some driver to move the tapes from one building to the next building. Well, the trunk or the boot of the car flipped open and the tapes flew out of the car, the boot, onto the highway, the side of the highway. The driver didn't notice. For 2 days, he looked for the tapes. He couldn't find them. The tapes were unencrypted, meaning anyone could access them. For 2 days, no one in the company knew that 50% of our customer data was sitting somewhere in a ditch, missing. You can only imagine how absolutely livid the board and the regulator was when they found out the facts 3 days later. You need a very quick escalation process. And when people don't escalate quickly, there needs to be demerit, and the board needs to know. Lastly, and the last few things I want to cover is transparency at all levels. And often in my experience in Cambodia, transparency starts with senior management and the board. That's wrong. Transparency starts with the business units. You need to be transparent. You need to produce dashboards for the business units. That's how you build culture. So the analogy I make on dealing with the business, because they can be a bit tricky, the business partners. Some that people say, oh, they don't want to do things. It's kind of this, for those of you who have kids, this is like getting your kids to do homework. Right now, you can yell at them, you can beat them. That never works, right? So you need to entice them. You need to motivate them. So dealing with the business partners when you're talking about risk is no different than trying to get your kids to do homework. Last few things on my part is the role of the board is critical to overall success of this. Absolutely critical. And the Cambodia Institute of Directors is here to help and educate, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. I have seen boards evolve, improve over time with the help of risk, quietly, behind the scenes, not in front of the whole board. But they have the responsibility to define the risk appetite, the tolerance of the company. That is what they are paid to do versus the budget. They need to make sure the right SOPs, people, and processes are in place to make this happen. And then they tell management, what they can do or not do in terms of taking risk. My last topic is on risk culture, and this is probably one of my least favorite topics because it's very difficult. It's hard. So these are my suggestions. And I've tried many, many organizations. First of all, it takes time. Don't assume this is going to be a 2025 KPI. This is like a 2025 to 2030 KPI every year. Find an advocate in the board to help you sponsor this project. You need to go to the board to have someone help you. Board risk chair, audit chair. They may be able to then help you convince the CEO. The CEO, you need his alignment. You need his support. How do you do that? You make sure that you align your risk to his strategy. Thirdly, you need to make the tools that I already talked about very simple: dashboards, common language, report to the first line of defense, know what's going on, and set red, amber, green. Start small. Do not try to solve this problem in 6 months. Be viewed as proactive. Help the business. The business partners will not want to do this. And if you're seen as someone who's helping, similar to when you study with your kids and their homework, they'll appreciate it. Ultimately, though, you have a responsibility to your board, your senior management, to the highest level of transparency, even if it's not good news. Over communicate and train endlessly. It's tedious, it's time consuming. But again, communicate and train endlessly. As I mentioned at CIMB, a relatively sophisticated bank, it took 4 to 5 years. And some outside pressure, particularly from independent board members. This is my presentation. I hope that I have been able to provide you useful comments and simple examples. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dave. Does anybody have any questions while you're thinking about it? I have one,
Okay.
Dave. And I have to say that it is, yeah, could everybody go on mute, please, while we're, thank you. Hi. Okay. Let me come back. Mine is based on something you said just almost at the end of your presentation. So much of everything that you said has really stuck with me and given me a lot to think about. But this one, so when you say permission for escalation, you know, when the guy dropped the tapes out of the trunk of the car on the side of the road and nobody knew about it for a couple of days. How do you give, I think that's a really tough thing, right? And especially in large organizations where, you know, what's the fear versus the reward? And how do people in leadership train down to understand that the reward needs to be greater than the fear to allow for that escalation?
Yeah. So particularly in an Asia context, this is very difficult. And sadly, positively, the board and the CEO need to communicate this. And there needs to be reporting, so the stick of when it's not done. So it's difficult to find incentives for people to want to do this. Because there is no reward, right? Because they're admitting there's a mistake. But they need to understand that there is a consequence if they don't do it. And again, often what comes back is, I didn't know there was an SOP in place. So it is a responsibility of the risk team to constantly educate people. There's a procedure. This is what it is, and this is what's expected of you.
Okay, so if you are the person setting the SOP, then how do you establish, is this a generic SOP that, I mean, it's definitely not going to be, did you drop the tapes out of the trunk of the car SOP? I mean, so, you know, how generic do you go?
Actually, you go quite specific. So this can be based on revenue loss, potential revenue loss. It could be impact to employees, such as a fire, et cetera, safety. It can be operational. So you can set multiple parameters, and then you would set a tolerance across maybe 3 or 4 metrics of escalation to my regional manager only, escalation to the CEO, escalation to the board, et cetera. So you would set criteria based on financial metrics, reputational metrics, regulatory metrics, or breaking the law potentially, and then set some level of tolerance that the board's approved, right? The board has to approve that tolerance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you're on the board, at what point, what's the balance there between senior management and the board in terms of determining what that is?
Yeah. So that comes down to the board's confidence in the risk team to execute its mandate. Are they strong enough to be able to challenge and deal with the business, or they don't have any power? So if the board feels that the organization maturity is not there, they may ask for quite a bit of escalation to understand, are these things getting fixed actually? Are they being addressed properly? Are people learning from it? Are there learnings so that we don't repeat it? So normally a board would see, if they see repeat audit issues, they know things are not working in this first and second line of defense, right? Mm-hmm. So the audit committee is often a tell-all if things are working. So it really comes down to maturity and the confidence of the board in the first and second line of defense to do it.
Does anybody else have questions? I mean, I could keep going all afternoon, but we're getting close to the end of your time commitment to us. So please, somebody jump in. You can drop it in the chat.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Certainly.
Go ahead.
So yeah, first of all, thank you, Dave, for the presentation. I just wonder, from your experience, is there a difference in the approach to the risk management and the execution of the risk management in Asia, comparing to USA or Europe?
Yeah, so good question. Thank you. The difficulty in Cambodia is just because of the evolution of the economy and the market. The central bank is not as demanding as in, say, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. The central bank puts a lot of pressure on the board, significant pressure on the boards, if they don't get the response they want from management around all these topics, including governance, risk culture, escalation. So the boards in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, a lot of pressure. US, enormous pressure. Europe, enormous pressure. In the case of Cambodia, just because of, it's a relatively not new, it's still emerging. The regulator doesn't have the bandwidth to quite do that yet. So it's harder in Cambodia to do this.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Certainly.
Anyone else? Questions? Okay. I will say again, thank you to all of you for joining us, and thank you especially, Dave, for really super presentation and a nutshell of what could be days and days and days of education on risk management. Any one of these bullet points, I'm sure we could go for at least half a day. We really super appreciate it. I do want to, again, thank everybody for joining us. Remind you that we do have these webinars on monthly basis with a couple of exceptions, namely July and December. And we have a series of workshops as well. So stay in touch with us. We'll be sending you a follow-up survey to get your feedback. And that's completely anonymous. So please be as frank as you possibly, as you would like. But please, actually, would be really helpful to us if you could just take a minute and fill it out, because that will help us serve you better and provide better programming, or the programming that you want the most in the future. Hope to see you next month, and we will be in touch. Stay tuned, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.